On the surface, there are actually a decent number of similarities between Toronto and Boston. Both are waterfront cities, both have the oldest rapid transit systems in their respective countries, and both have systems that are in many ways quite similar, with trams, subways, and lots of diesel-powered suburban trains. But Toronto and Boston have taken and are on different paths. Boston has built a lot less in the last decade or so than Toronto has, and that trend seems to be seriously accelerating. While quality of life problems in Boston have been a serious issue for a number of years, although they are finally starting to subside, Toronto is just beginning to have its own quality of life and state of good repair issues. And perhaps most importantly, the cities do play different roles in their respective countries. Boston is the higher education capital of the United States, while Toronto is Canada's biggest and most important city. The interplay and contrast between these two cities meant that when I was working on my Boston Explainer recently, I thought about doing something I haven't done in a long time, a transit battle, to see which North American transit heavyweight has the better system, and what they can learn from one another. So let's dive in. Welcome to RM Transit, where we sometimes compare two transit systems in an all-out battle to the death. The idea here is to try to do a like-for-like comparison between Toronto and Boston. Subways versus subways, trams versus trams, etc. There will also be an X-Factor round that's meant to round up all of the other differences that aren't necessarily easy to categorize. Now I've got to be clear, I'm not doing a purely quantitative comparison. Boston has more stops than Toronto, but only light rail stops, unless you count them as stations if they're underground. These kinds of comparisons just aren't helpful. Toronto and Boston have systems of a similar scale. And when two systems are of similar scale, what differentiates them is typically everything but the number of stations and the track length. I'll note for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be comparing the regional transit systems for both cities. In Boston, the MBTA really is the regional agency, while in Toronto there are local municipal transit agencies as well as the regional GO Transit system. I'm not just comparing the TTC to the MBTA because it wouldn't make sense to compare a local system to one that covers the entire region. With that out of the way, let's begin with the subway systems. Toronto and Boston both currently have 3 proper subway lines, with 2 major ones and 1 more minor one in both cities. Though in Boston, minor means small trains dead-ending downtown, while in Toronto it means a 5-stop suburban line on Shepherd Avenue. In Toronto, the trains are both wider and longer than on any of Boston's lines, and all 3 current lines are capable of operating 6-car trains if that capacity is needed in the long term, with lines 1 and 2 already there. Unlike in Boston, all of the Toronto subway lines are intercompatible, the trains have the same loading gauge, and the electrification setup is the same, so vehicles can be shuffled from line to line, although that isn't really frequently done in practice. What it does enable is for trains to be cascaded from line to line over time. So when a new fleet of trains was historically entered into service on line 1, its trains would go to line 2. Where Boston actually really stands out is for coloring its trains based on the lines that they actually operate on, which is a really nice touch, and which Toronto sort of tried at one point. I will say Boston's wayfinding is also miles ahead of Toronto's, if not as nice as wayfinding in like London, for example. It's just more usable and also quite iconic. Fortunately, we do have a plan for that. In all fairness though, Toronto's trains are functional. They're also really big, fully walk-through, and quite a bit higher quality than Boston's latest, albeit without the same nice wayfinding screens. Toronto ekes out another win on service frequencies. Boston's frequencies aren't bad, certainly not by American standards, but the reality is that off-peak service in Toronto tends to look like peak service in Boston. That being said, Toronto needs to be really careful because it has been slipping on the service side recently. Neither city has 24-hour subway service, but both should consider it, akin to what London and Berlin have, where trains operate 24 hours a day on the weekends. Network form and the reach of the subway is a very interesting comparison between these two. On the surface, both are radial, and both networks' radial legs shoot out in every which direction, though Boston wins here because it has the blue line creating another radial leg. What's nice about Toronto though is that the way that Line 2 skims the top of downtown means that it's not only useful as a radial service but also as a crosstown, and it gets a ton of ridership. In fact, Line 2 in Toronto moves far more people than all of Boston's subway lines combined. All of this probably makes Boston's network more downtown-centric, and that's elevated by the fact that there are fantastic interconnections to all of the various high-frequency suburban buses operating on a gridded pattern throughout Toronto, with connections into the subway. I will say, while it's neither here nor there, most of Boston's subway system is above ground in the suburbs, while Toronto's is mostly below ground. There are above-ground sections, of course, but not so much above-ground rail-style alignments following suburban rail corridors. And with that, Toronto handily takes the first round. The TTC subway is not significantly bigger than Boston's subway system, but I do think it's quite a bit nicer. And while the system's history is a lot less interesting, Boston has all kinds of old elevated lines and tram tunnels, Toronto has it where it counts: great service and excellent integration with the rest of the system. Both Boston and Toronto are tram towns, with old interurbans, streetcar-style routes, and modern-feeling urban trams. But Boston is, I think, better off, and this is a good example of how looking at a map can give you a wrong idea of how good a transit system actually is in practice. Toronto's streetcar network looks extensive, and with 6 east-west streetcar routes across the core and several north-south routes, it actually is. And these routes have pretty frequent service, and sometimes at the end of a route they even head underground or connect directly into the subway system to provide high-quality transfers. But Boston just puts its trams to better use. Namely with the Green Line, which, to be clear, carries Boston in this category. I'm basically not going to consider the Mattapan trolley a serious modern transit service, though it is fortunately being modernized, so maybe that can change in the future. What's nice about the Green Line is it doesn't just go underground to connect to the subway, but to become one through central Boston. And that lets trams do what they do best, seamlessly blending suburban routes with a downtown tunnel that provides high-speed rapid transit style service. Not to mention lots of one-seat rides. And what's quite interesting is that a bunch of Boston's branches are quite heavily grade separated, meaning there are some services which operate almost entirely like rapid transit. That's really the issue with Toronto streetcars, they're just so slow. Often, even when they have their own lanes, they essentially end up functioning like buses. But they're worse than buses because they can't weave around traffic and other obstructions. I'd rather one great cross-city route like Boston has, and like Toronto once considered, than 6 rather mediocre east-west streetcar lines. And what's worse is that since Toronto has this attitude that streetcar service must rule the roost for local transit service downtown, there aren't a ton of great bus routes supplementing the streetcars, and that means that most local transit service in downtown Toronto is rather slow. And as cycling options have gotten far, far better, you often see cyclists blowing past slow streetcars that have to often stop twice on a single block and get stuck in traffic. And Boston's not just better off because the Green Line is a subway in the middle. While it's not exactly cutting edge, the Green Line does at least feel like a late 20th century US LRT, which means you have bi-directional cars and other niceties like that, as well as decent platforms with decent next train screens. It all just feels much more extensively modernized than the Toronto streetcars, short of the vehicles of course, but that's something they're going to fix. Now before you say it, yes, Toronto is building a number of suburban tramways, and to Toronto's credit, it has modernized a couple streetcar routes, albeit with mixed results. But these lines still aren't open, and the lack of branches on the suburban part of the crosstown means that its raison d'etre as a hybrid subway surface line doesn't really make sense. Boston clearly takes this round. At first, contrasting the suburban rail in Boston with Toronto might make it seem like Boston has a clear win here. It has 12 lines while Toronto has just 7. But, as with the streetcars, the map doesn't exactly tell the full story. Boston's suburban rail is a very large network, but that's where the major positives stop. The network is split into 2, the trains and platform heights aren't really consistent and often don't look great, the service frequencies leave a lot to be desired, and even sections that have electric wires overhead don't actually use electric trains. By comparison, the GO train network has been hitting its stride, and while only 5 of the lines are meant to have frequent regular service, those lines have seen serious upgrades. The Lakeshore line is back to its pre-COVID 15-minute service on weekends and will probably get it back during weekdays. There's the Up Express service on the Kitchener line, which serves some core stations with 15-minute service all day, every day. Meanwhile, in the last few years, big chunks of the Barrie, Kitchener, and Stouffville lines started seeing all-day regular hourly service in both directions, which is huge. And sometimes the service is even better than hourly. What's more, the infrastructure to allow 15-minute or better service across the entire network beyond just Lakeshore is coming together quite nicely, with tons of dramatic bridges and tunnels, but also a lot of double tracking and triple tracking. On top of all of that, GO has a certain niceness factor. The new cab cars look really modern, and actually give the trains a look, at least going in one direction, that feels like it could potentially be at home in Europe. Every car in the system is also the same model, and it's a pretty good model. Furthermore, Toronto's network isn't just unified at Union, but it also through runs across downtown, meaning a fairly large number of train services operate from one suburb to another. And this is only going to increase in the future, as the GO expansion program electrifies the network and installs the European train control system to enable much higher frequencies. Now, Boston and Toronto do both deserve kudos for doing a good job connecting up their subway and suburban train networks, including in a number of places outside of their respective city centers, which really allows the networks to function as a common system, something which is unfortunately not all that common on this continent. You might mention that Boston is working to finally electrify those services which already operate under wires for significant chunks of their routes, but unfortunately, as with Toronto a couple years ago with the hydrogen bug, the battery train bug has stung Boston. And while battery trains are fine, I guess, at the end of the day, what matters for your trains really isn't how they're powered, but how frequently they run, at least when they're running only a couple times a day sometimes. GO shows that you don't need to have electric trains to have a decent regional service with a high level of frequency, and so this round goes to Toronto. Finally, we get to the X Factor, all of the things that aren't wrapped up in the maps, trams, and trains of Boston and Toronto. And frankly, that includes some pretty neat and important stuff. Both cities have a lot of transit-oriented development and polycentrism, with Toronto's mostly taking the form of putting up high-rise towers anywhere will allow housing to be built. Boston's development pattern is a lot nicer, with a lot of dense but not necessarily always towering development near the universities and various transit hubs. Boston also gets major points for its chaotic and very cool downtown that has a highway running under it rather than through it. Boston also benefits a lot from being on the Northeast Corridor. While you can take a train from Toronto to Montreal a couple times a day, you can frequently take a high-speed electric one from Boston to New York, Washington DC, or Philly. It's just way better. But to be fair, Toronto does deserve some points for having not just one, but two rail-connected airports, with the downtown airport, where you can take a flight to Boston, being accessible not only by streetcar, but also by cycling and even comfortably walking up. Both systems actually also have some interesting tunnels which connect their buses and trams into their rapid transit systems. From St. Clair West Station to Harvard and the Silver Line tunnels, there's actually a lot here that other cities in North America, and sometimes around the world, could really benefit from. And while Boston does have the Silver Line, which is a surprisingly good North American bus rapid transit system, Toronto does have Viva and the Mississauga Transitway, as mixed as those systems are. Fortunately, Toronto operates such good suburban bus service, at least in the city of Toronto and Brampton, that you don't really need to worry about typical North American BRT. The service is so frequent that you save lots of time just by not sitting at the curb. And there's a great night network to boot, something which Boston definitely could benefit from emulating. At the end of the day, I think Toronto should take the X Factor though, because it is building so much. GO already has the infrastructure to significantly continue to ramp up service, and at the same time, that network is seeing massive station rebuilds that make the stations look more like facilities in Europe or Asia than in North America. There are also 3 light rail lines nearing completion, 3 subway extensions which are moving along, and an entirely new modern downtown subway line that Toronto's building. While I think that even today Toronto puts up a good fight against Boston, 10-20 years down the road, I think Toronto is going to be way ahead if Boston doesn't start getting serious about building more transit and getting its costs down. But that said, I'd like to know what you think. Leave a comment down below, and as always, thanks for watching.